Hey folks, welcome to another episode of The Hole on the Corner. I'm Dan Peterson, aka Dr. Rockter, and in this episode we are continuing our chapter by chapter outline of R.A. Lafferty's Past Master. And in this video we're going through chapters 5 through 8, which is probably my personal favorite chunk of the novel. And there's a lot of chewy, dense stuff to get into here, and I will try not to get into it and keep it semi-brief and concise. So, Chapter 5, The Shape of Things to Come, which is the title of a sort of utopian-type novel by H.G. Wells, and I'm quite sure that Lafferty is consciously riffing on that. I know he was a reader of Wells. And it reminds me that this novel is very much in conversation with some of those greats of utopian dystopian literature, like 1984 and Brave New World. And lesser known than those two big works would be something like Wells's The Shape of Things to Come, which I have not read, but plan to do at some point, thinking about it vis-a-vis this novel. And you know that something about this idea of the shape of things to come is important for Lafferty because a later chapter, chapter 10, is called The Deformity of Things to Come. So we'll get to that. So as I said in conclusion to the last video, something of the plot proper really starts here. There's been a lot of talk and action that sort of sets up everything about the novel in the first 4 chapters. And they've been exciting and adventurous and so on. But the novel is about encountering the utopia and its shadow cities on this planet, Astrobe, through Thomas More and his retinue, and thereby for us as the readers. And it's only at this point in the novel that this becomes a quite intentional thing with More, who is now going to step out and bit by bit explore this. So after the conversation-heavy previous chapter, this one moves on a little more in terms of action and events. Not necessarily action-adventure type stuff, but there's more movement and things going on. And we're given several strong and vivid sort of set pieces in the utopian city. And I mentioned in the last video that Lafferty kind of does a cheat where he describes everything else, the feral regions and the slum cities and the past and hyperspace and everything and all this intense imagery and stuff. But the utopian city itself, in terms of its people, its structures, its buildings, its culture, and so on, just almost zero description, except to say it was elegant and grand and things like these. So when I say there are a couple vivid set pieces in the utopian city in this chapter, I don't mean that he's actually going to end up describing those things he has so far elided. Rather, this is going to have to do with basically what is wrong with this utopian city. So the structure of the chapter is that Thomas learns some more details about the utopian city. We get some, it's funny because I was going to say we get some info dump through a fictional device here. And I suppose we've had a fair bit of that up till now in the conversations. But funnily enough, I never think of them that way. They are doing exposition work, but as I've said many times, they're more like a traditional philosophical dialogue type structure. So to the degree that they're doing expositional work, either consciously or self-consciously from Lafferty's point of view, it's pretty well hidden in there in that dialogue format. Though, as I've said, that itself has its own issues of pacing and stuff. But here the device is that Thomas consults this Précis machine, which this time around I was actually reminded of the recent Dune film, the first one, I still haven't seen the second one, where the main character, what is he called, Paul, is learning about Dune and stuff from some kind of computer machine thing. And it's pretty nicely done. I've read Dune the novel, but it's been way too long and I can't remember how it comes across in the novel. But you have something equivalent here, but in a Laffertian mode. And there's some more interesting contours of the society given through this. And then Thomas attends this coin-operated, blasphemous Catholic mass there in the city, which is one of the best scenes of the novel. And I can't wait to do more of the deep dive with that. It's a lot to think about there. Then, one of my all-time favorite passages in this novel, kind of back-to-back there with this blasphemous mass, followed by Rimrock, the ansel, the indigenous species of this planet, tells the myth of his people's evolution to higher consciousness in his current form, which is fantastic. And as with so many of these set pieces, it speaks to the overall plot and theme and so on. And then somewhat mirroring what happened in the previous chapter, where you get a conversation between each of the leaders of Astrobe and Thomas, and thereby get some more characterization of them. Here, you get these little chunks that are not conversation, they're just narrated little portraits of several characters that are part of Thomas's retinue. So Evita, Scrivener, Slider, Maxwell, and Walter Copperhead, the necromancer. So it's quite odd narrationally the way that works. And again, Lafferty's penchant for like, here's a piece, here's a piece, here's a piece. Let your imagination glue them together as you will. Which, incidentally, is something I talked about in my response video to Literally Books and Liminal Spaces and their recent encounters, first encounters with Lafferty, and my ideas of a burgeoning readership of Lafferty, that I talked about how Lafferty himself, in his introduction to The Devil is Dead, it urges us as readers to use the pieces he set out in his particular order, but to out and out rearrange them and play with them as we will. And this is one of his novels that most puts that at the surface, and you can see the sort of playing blocks that we've been given in the very narrative form. And then this chapter closes with more feeling this call to the mountains outside of the city and in the Faro regions, setting up the subsequent chapter. So I think this might be the most variegated, multifaceted sort of chapter so far that seems to have quite a few different pieces loosely interrelated. I mean, this starts pretty straightforward with more looking at a few things in the city, but then with Rimrock's myth and these little portraits of the other characters and so on, it's pretty odd. But in this case, actually, I find this chapter far less stop-start or troublesome with pacing. It's so interesting. Each little set piece just really fires off in the mind, and it's quite a pleasure to read, even if you don't necessarily get a super strong sense of how it all holds together by the time you're through with it. I do think intuitively it's tying together as you go through. So this précis machine, and précis is a term that Lafferty uses again technically in Arrive at Easterwine, saying that AI entity, Epictistes, is made up of the précis of each of the members of the Institute for Impure Science, which is some kind of like personality summary and essence or something from each of them. And that is the form of its intelligence and sentience. And then in many ways, that whole novel is built around kind of looking at each of those précis. So it's a term he liked, but here it's simply a delivery format for details about the planet. And in some ways, it might almost get even more philosophical here than it has been in previous chapters, though they contained much of philosophical content. But it's only for this portion when he's interacting with the précis machine. But I suppose it's in regard to nothingness, this idea of nothingness, and Udin, the nothingness monster. It starts to press on that a little bit more. And for my predilections and preferences, this is of much greater interest to me than some of the political chat and so on in other parts of the novel, though those become increasingly interesting to me. But this has a lot to do with sort of mirology, like parts and wholes, and monism, like everything is one, versus some form of multiplicity, and individualism versus group identity, and the long-standing issue in philosophy of the one and the many. And it's pretty cool. So I'm looking forward to getting into that. And one of Lafferty's overt foils in this novel and in a bunch of his fiction, often named, and I don't think he is named in this novel, but a few of his ideas are obliquely named. But this gets into the Teilhardian, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a Catholic priest and paleontologist from earlier in the 20th century who wrote theoretically and philosophically about sort of grand ideas of evolution as a progressive thing moving towards more and more complexity and unity. And Lafferty felt that that thought betrayed key Catholic concepts, particularly that it emphasized the one far too much over the many, and indeed erased the many for the one, so the individuality of all sorts, human or otherwise, is ultimately lost. And particularly in this novel, he seems to read Teilhard's thought as basically nihilistic in the end. So I've read a bit of Teilhard, and it's very interesting. He is a good writer and a super interesting thinker. And scientists in particular are very mixed on him and divided to the degree that any of them even look at him. I think mostly he's been panned by scientists, but there are some current or currentish sort of evolutionary biologists and so on that thought, whilst there's certainly error in there, he was on to something. And I'd be interested to see where else he might be picked up in science fiction, because I was very shocked to note that Teilhard is name-dropped specifically, overtly, in Greg Bear's Blood Music to indeed sort of explain some of what's happening in the novel molecularly and cosmically. And it's just a gesture toward Teilhard, but it's suggested that, like, yeah, that would be one way to kind of picture what's happening here. So fascinating. So I will, as we get into the deep dives, I will try to read some more Teilhard to engage that a little more. But in this conversation with the Précis machine, that is part of what the philosophical aspect of the novel is getting at. And as learns more about the planet and the utopian society, he's mixed and he's impressed and yet not impressed with some things. But it's here that he learns about the feral strips, the feral regions. I mean, even a few other sort of world-building details are just dropped in here barely. But as he begins to walk around, and we don't get much description of this, he does find himself already being bored by the perfection of the utopian society, finds it cloying. And I've mentioned before that they talked about how there are these like suicide booths, they call them termination booths, that people use all too frequently from a young age onward to, opt out, like not to go off to the slum cities, but they also don't necessarily enjoy this utopian city, and off they go. And some architects of the society celebrate this and some don't. But I mean, just the whole idea of having suicide booths built into your utopian society, wow, that's fascinating. That might be something to really chew over and think about as we get into it. And, just to say, like, I think Lafferty puts that forward as like a shocker, like, woo, isn't this obviously bad? And it's effective in that way. It does strike me as weird and a little off-putting. But that said, I don't know exactly where I stand with all these kinds of things, but I am not unsympathetic to issues around euthanasia and a right to death as much as a right to life in various circumstances and so on. It's complicated issues. So to the degree that Past Master is trying to uncomplicate those issues, I think we can, critique that and think about it. But as Thomas is walking through the city, he says, I have to hold on to myself with both hands every time I pass a termination booth, just to not just throw himself in there and get it done with this. So as he's walking about, he comes upon the automated mass. It's sort of a museum piece. And it's just so vividly described. It's sort of like a animatronic puppet show with various sort of blasphemous or abject replacements for the central material objects of the mass. The Virgin is holding a monkey instead of the baby Jesus, and for the host, the bread of the Eucharist, I think they're eating hot dog rolls, and the wine is grape juice, and there's like commercials for a brand of grape juice and a little news report, and it says so that you're not, outside of the real world for too long in this kind of implied pointless little ritual. I think there's some puppetry drug use in it and things like that. And it's brief, it's like maybe a page or so, but it is so vividly drawn. It is one of the best examples of Lafferty doing a lot of work in one simple scene, setting it there, and it just shines forth. It's the kind of thing you want to go back and look at. And it gives strong dystopian vibes of things like, vaguely maybe A Clockwork Orange. And I guess for me, there are little notes in this novel that I think anticipate some cyberpunk stuff, but also just weird fiction and new weird fiction. And I've mentioned before that Lafferty can have tiny, like Ligotti-esque notes. And again here, I think there's some slight connection to his contemporaries, Ellison and Delaney and Zelazny and so on. And I'm really keen to get into a discussion of it because it's complicated. Like, I understand Lafferty's point and what he's doing with it, but I also have come to think that there is a very important place for blasphemy, sacrilege, even in forms such as out and out, Satanism or devil worship or what have you, whether, playful or I don't know, whatever, but there's a lot going on there. And it can be a really, really, really important form or mode of resistance to religious and cultural, more generally, structures and strictures, and can't just be discounted as being just crassly provocative or whatever. And as usual, Lafferty, when he satirizes things like rock and roll and rock culture and the anti-establishment and drug use and so on, he does such a good job of it that he almost backs into poeticizing it. And I think half consciously exemplifying and acknowledging its potency. Like, as an artist, I think he can't help himself and he gets into it. So I don't know. I do actually think that he's letting out some of his own demons, so to speak, and shadow and what have you, when he so often vividly portrays what he finds dystopian and stuff. And I do think he partly knows what he's doing there. I think some of it's unconscious and I think some of it is intentional in that, he has an attitude of going through to go beyond. And his own vision of a thriving and robust society and world is equally potent and earthy, even dirty and raucous and sort of dangerous and wild and funny and irreverent as the things that he's satirizing. So it's almost like he's trying to show the correlations and resonances between his vision and the one that he finds destructive, almost as if to say, yeah, you're kind of onto something, but this is what I think is better and really maybe what you're after, or something along those lines. It's interesting. And Thomas More calls it dirty and finds it a bit pointless if, religion really is passé and not a part of this society. And as I mentioned, More himself doesn't really have belief anymore. But despite any misgivings he has at this point, it says of More, now he had swallowed bait, hook, line, rod, and fisherman's arm, and he becomes a sudden, strong advocate of the utopia. And even with his embrace of it, the leaders express this concern that though More is free to visit any part of the planet and explore it, they worry that without their guidance, he, as it says, will not know how to see the planet, and that he doesn't have, as it says, the eyes for it. So there's definitely a lot of pressure on More to see this the way the social engineers want him to see it, and eventually that will technologically even come into his mind and brain and try to control him in that way. And it's at this point that it's almost as if the narrator's like, what else can I say this chapter? Let me list out some of the characters and tell you a little bit about them. And we've already seen, several grouping lists, but in this case, they're itemized and each one is opened out to several paragraphs or pages talking about them, beginning with Rimrock, the ansel. Now, one of the best things about this indigenous species in this novel And an aspect of the novel that I really did not clock the first time through, and probably the second time through, or I was getting it but not too consciously, that is, I think, a real mystery of the novel. And I have not read Gene Wolfe's The Fifth Head of Cerberus for quite some time, so it's a little bit of an old memory of reading that, but I feel really strong resonances with that novel or fix-up novel and the issue with the ansels in Past Master in particular, and the indigenous people in Wolfe's Fifth Head of Cerberus. So I'd love to see somebody make that comparison someday in some detail. That'd be cool. But Past Master seems to suggest that there is a symbiotic relationship between these Earth colonizers and the indigenous species, in that they were non-human animals prior to contact, and somehow contact with these Earth humans raised them to this human or human-like level of consciousness and sentience, which is really strange. And, you know, it's probably more science fantasy than anything. It's kind of magical, but it also mythologizes evolution. And I know that Lafferty was really interested in Stephen Jay Gould's ideas of punctuated equilibrium, where evolution stays steady for very, very long periods of time and then cataclysmically shifts and new species evolve and so on. Lafferty just loved that idea, and in its way and variations is all over his fiction, and I suspect is influencing this idea. But what Rimrock sort of reveals here in his telling of this myth is that symbiosis, as symbiosis does, goes both ways. And that basically, you know, Earth people, through whatever means, have somewhat lost their unconscious or lost being in touch with their unconscious and with their psychological depths. And while contact has raised these animals to this level of consciousness, in turn, these beings, the ansels, being telepathic beings, as well as physically oceanic beings, the ansels have entered into the psyches of the humans and now provide a sort of replacement consciousness for them, or replacement unconscious for them, and swim through their dreams, so to speak. And it's a pretty long passage as Lafferty goes, a good, 3 or 4 pages, I think. So there's a fair bit of detail in there. It's like myth and fable and tall tale, but it really speaks to their like sort of long, slow climb toward evolution, even though there's this sudden moment of rupture and fast-forwarded change and mutation. But it talks about the upper reaches of the oceanic water being their sky, and they have mountains underwater and can climb those mountains to the top and be sort of in that water sky. But then they broke through the sky and went into the land on top of the sky. And as Rimrock says, our legend is that we are the people who climbed all the way to the sky, broke holes in it, and climbed out into a strange world that is above the sky. And he says that, you're land people, so you can't understand how big this is for us. And he says, you do not feel it, but we do. Which is just cool on so many levels. And even as Rimrock is telling this story, it says that he switches from verbal speech to suddenly telling the rest of the story in their minds. But he says that you do not appreciate the magnitude of this discovery and change in the world above the sky. And he says, you did it so long ago that you have forgotten it, both in your minds and your underminds. But how can you forget that you live on top of the sky? And then he says that every moment you are walking on a precarious rug higher than a 5,000 story high building. And as I've said, for me personally, science fiction that lacks wonder, a sense of wonder, and evoking that is, for me, kind of missing the point and not very enjoyable for me. And indeed, Lafferty, when he wrote about science fiction from time to time, said that was the key thing for him as well, a sense of wonder. And Rimrock here says, of this breaking holes in the sky and now being on the land above the sky, may the sense of wonder never leave me. And that's an important part of this book, and a question about, like, does utopia really allow for that sense of wonder, and not least through rupture, and indeed you could say rapture, that is breaking holes in things and going beyond whatever the current sky is. And then Rimrock sums up some of that symbiosis relationship in regard to the unconscious in one of my all-time favorite quotes from the book that I've used many times across the years. Regular people have sealed off the interior ocean that used to be in every man, Rimrock said. They closed the ocean and ground up its monsters for fertilizer. That is why we so often enter into people's dreams. We take the place of the monsters they have lost. Yes! Wow! We take the place of the monsters they have lost. And just a reminder, he is described as something like a seal-like creature, kind of seal anthropoid. Hints of walrus in there too, because of sometimes having seemingly long, sharp tusks. I say sometimes because they're metamorphic, they're shapeshifters, and they can go on 2 legs, 4 legs, or no legs, and just fins. And so in their very form and in their powers, telepathy and so on, they represent a sort of numinous monstrosity. And this is something I talked about in my dissertation, and have mentioned many times that Lafferty is extremely useful all across his body of work for monster theory, especially for kind of breaking and reconstructing some somewhat ossified ideas about monster theory in academy. But so often monsters are kind of disallowed from being associated with the good or the holy or what have you. I mean, that is acknowledged in monster theory, but not to the extent that it could be, and that there's just this tendency to see monstrosity as a form of evil, malevolence, destruction, and so on, whereas in fact it can be seen in a whole spectrum of valences. And one of my easier things to just point to demonstrate that outside of Lafferty is to just go look at Japanese yokai, and there's just a huge spectrum of what those monsters are and can be and represent, from the holy to the evil and everything in between and other and so on. And after Rimrock has relayed this myth of origins, he mentions kind of offhandedly that the 2 main jobs that ansels now have in this society are as communication centers, as it says, because of their telepathy. People use them as like a telephone exchange, and as underwater welders in extremely toxic conditions off the coasts of these slum cities. And it mentions the detail that the ansels are not paid very well for this work either. And it's such a poignant picture for me to think of, once you've seen these creatures and their origin, they're almost like oceanic angels. And some have wondered if, because nobody seems to know what this ansel word comes from or means, and some have wondered if it's meant to sound a bit like angels. But even apart from that word, I got that sort of association. And that's why I call them numinous and stuff. But Rimrock himself comes across, and generally they seem to come across as, albeit somewhat romanticized, but sort of like these like beautiful souls, gentle creatures that can nevertheless be powerful warriors. But seeing them do this kind of working class work in toxic conditions just has a pathos to it. And to be fair, it's like working almost purely in archetypes with this species, because to get a better picture of them, we would need to see more of their society and other characters than Rimrock, and he's the only one we ever hear from, though you kind of see others pictured here and there. And you do at least get a sense of their earthiness. I think Rimrock jokes around a bit, and their favorite pastime is to play Fantan, a Chinese gambling game. But nevertheless, whatever the sort of complications here, it's a very memorable alien species in its way that almost creeps up on you as to its kind of density and the power of its evocation of the alien and of alien species being in contact with one another. So then the novel moves into its pretty brief portraits of these 5 other characters, beginning with Evita, that it describes as a scrawny child witch. And she's already been described in similar terms before this. And she's considered both Eve and Lilith. But In introducing this part, it says of her, "Well, what was Evita? We don't know. Thomas never knew. She was never sure herself." And she is a mysterious character in the novel, and I think I've finally pieced together a few things about her. And it's again one of those qualities that's not unlike reading Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe or what have you, where, you know, it can invite a lot of theories and stuff. So I'll be interested to see what people make of her. And Thomas says of her, despite her name, that she's more like Lilith than Eve, and she's likened to that and other female archetypes in other parts of the novel. And it describes her, despite him constantly calling her scrawny, she is of copious build, as it says, and she smiles down on Thomas. So she's large as a woman and described as, you know, incomparably beautiful and all these things. And again, in keeping with the constant affirmation of mutually exclusive things about her, whether it's her nature as Lilith or Eve or more, or her stature as scrawny or large. It says of her eyes, it'll do this with her voice too, but in keeping this sort of mystery even about her physical appearance, it says, "The color of her hair, the color of her eyes, the incredible lines of her, no, they won't be given here. You will not know them till the last day, and then only if you are one of the blessed." So it moves on to these other characters, and with most each of them, it begins with, "Hear so-and-so speak." And then you get some like speeches or soliloquies from each of them, telling more about their character and their views. And through that, some more of the philosophical ruminations of the novel. So we'll get into the details later, but these two characters, Slider and Scrivener, who are constantly mentioned, I get them mixed up all the time, and not least because of their names, and I'm sure that's very intentional. And it's so funny because they're so effective in that, because all the characters also get them mixed up. And that's how they come across in the novel. And one or both of them, like with Evita and various other things, there's a question as to whether some of the riddles there are solvable at all, and then theories as to which way to solve them. But it seems to be that they might both be programmed people, or certainly one of them is partially programmed people. And again, assuming that means something like androids or replicants, though I'm not 100% sure on that. But one of them is said to have a parent that is quote-unquote fully human and one that is a programmed person. Again, with potential ties here to things in, you know, Philip K. Dick, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and or the mythos built out of that in the Blade Runner movies, etc. But they're almost these like comic side characters, and there's a question of, you know, the more programmed person they behave, the more in line with utopia they are, and whenever they aren't so much like that, then they can even be pursued by the mechanical killers and stuff, and they can be kind of moody and stuff. But Slider says a kind of emblematic statement in the novel, "When the killers pursue me, then I feel that I am coming near some truth, but when they let me alone, I know that I am dealing in trivialities." And the whole novel suggests if you're on the wrong side of utopia, social engineering, then you're probably on the right track. And if you're not in any trouble with the utopian, you know, dream and structure, you're probably, you know, living in trivialities. Make of that what you will, but I do think that's some of what the novel is trying to get at. And in the two sort of soliloquies from Slider and Scrivener, they have a sort of debate about this idea of a divine promise, like a biblical divine promise about the church or the faithful, the flock, living on no matter the circumstances and always having a remnant. And whether that applies on some distant planet, not of Earth, where the promise was made, and indeed whether it applies to other than humans, whether that's another species or AI and so on. Which I have to say, actually I do think can get into some really interesting theological issues and ideas, really no matter how you understand religion and spirituality and that kind of thing. But just thinking like, can these sorts of things apply to, for example, AI and stuff like that? Could be really interesting questions there. And it doesn't seem to me that the novel very, very clearly lands on one side or the other of that kind of debate. I could be wrong. We'll see how people take it. But to the degree that it allows for ambivalence there, or even just makes it a very complicated question, no matter where it lands, that contributes to what I've said is some genuine ambiguity and ambivalence in this novel as regards technology in general and AI in particular in Lafferty, which, as I've said, he'll explore much more, and in some ways a more positive way in Arrive at Easterwine. But he sets up a lot of that here, and I do think it would be a mistake to read the novel as just anti-technology, anti-AI. And certainly Lafferty was not by any means anti-technology. He loved it. And Pastmaster and Arrive at Easterwine are not the only places that he deals with the reality of intelligent machines really being part of existence, of planetary existence, of coexistence, of the human and non-human and more than human drama that we find ourselves in, and indeed just part of the company and kinship of existing beings in the universe. He kind of assumes that thinking computers and robots or whatever are part of that in his way. And you kind of have to get into some deep cuts to see that very clearly, but it's there in some of the popular stuff too. So Maxwell is this other character that we've seen a little bit here and there, and it's very strange because there's these two characters. Oh man, there's so many weird things going on. And this is part of that, like I said, this retinue around Thomas More is not some like perfect, squeaky clean, lovely people type alternate community to the utopian ideals. It's a very messy, slippery, shifting, in its own way, monstrous grouping of persons that still manage to band together in resistance to the utopian dream, ultimately. And so there's these two characters, Adam, who is said to die and then live again over and over, though it's like stipulated that this isn't like a resurrection, it's just dying and living again or something. And in a different but resonant vein, Maxwell is said to, whatever he is, to move from body to body from time to time. And this is just like, those are the kinds of things that are packed into a novel like this that do make people walk away going, now wait, what did I just read? What just happened? And then indeed give it that, science fantasy type feel as well. But speaking to this monstrousness of non-utopians, almost like a fruitful monstrousness of those who are against the social engineering and so on, Maxwell says of himself, "I am an aberration. A perfect world would be made up of perfectly integrated persons, and I am not one. There are no words for my particular wandering from the normal. Only Copperhead knows me well enough to have any idea what they are. I will only say that I have a very loose attachment to my own body. I have not always been in the same form. I do not always recognize my previous forms. The great Astrobian advance was bound to throw off such reactions as myself." Man, there's a lot to think about in that. And this is, again, so I haven't quoted a lot of what I'm calling the philosophical conversations and stuff, but they are full of this kind of stuff to chew over. It's very interesting. But again, it suggests that Lafferty is portraying a picture of alternate community that is in part made up of aberrations, of abnormality, quote unquote, of what doesn't fit the social engineering norms and so on. Particularly doesn't fit this idea of social perfection, and that there are forms of personal integration that are reductive, and to not be perfectly integrated as a person is important. And indeed, as we saw, it's only such people, sort of maladjusted as it says, that can like pilot through Hop equation space, and that perfectly adjusted people would break up and go mad from it. So this isn't even saying this is a form of insanity. This is a way not to be insane, not to be broken really by the realities of the world. But in that language of wandering from the normal, it's great. But he mentions his loose attachment to his body, but also this wonderful statement that the Astrobian advance was bound to throw off reactions like Maxwell. So there's, as with the contact with the ansel species creating this new thing, so also there seems to be something about the nature of this utopian progression that not only like spins off whole new evolutions of species and spins off evolutions of a different kind of species, you could say, that is AI, the programmed people, but also in the original humans creates new psychological and through that like physical manifestations of modes of being, in this case sort of wandering from body to body. Very, very interesting. And it's through this kind of like almost phantasmagoria that you push into real things, and speak to the ways our social projects and milieus really change what we are as human beings. And despite Lafferty being self-consciously and staunchly Aristotelian Thomistic in his philosophical orientation, which would involve things like essences, whatever he thinks about essences, as I said in my videos on the short story Snuffles, that he puts across something like a weird essence as well as a weird telos, so that if there are essences, they are strange, is seemingly mutable, capable of mutation and change, not static. And again, I would point toward Timothy Morton's book Dark Ecology, where he talks about some weird essentialism that involves a sort of flickering and shuddering of being, and that persons and things are not always present. And he digs in and says that this sort of undermines basic philosophical principles of non-contradiction and stuff. It's very interesting, very hard to read, but very like Lafferty's most experimental stuff, in that it really sets your brain on fire with wonderful images and ideas, whilst kind of in that same fire melting your brain with like, oh, this is difficult to affirm seemingly mutually exclusive things and stuff. Very good book. But I think Lafferty's ideas here can be put into conversation with such things. And I'll just mention here that while not a whole lot is done with this Maxwell character, there's a moment very late in the novel where he comes back into it in the funniest and most unexpected of ways. I can't wait to get to that. And there's a cool physical description of Maxwell's appearance and the looseness of his body, which is an idea that Lafferty loves to come back to. It comes up particularly in Fourth Mansions. But he often likens certain human characters to certain kinds of animals, like big cats and stuff with loose skin, and talks about humans both literally and metaphorically being loose in their skin. And Maxwell's another one of these. And so it goes on to Copperhead, Walter Copperhead, the necromancer. And he too seems to be some sort of mutation that the utopian dream has thrown out, in the sense of like tossing it out there, not like kicking it out, though there's elements of that too. But Copperhead says, "I do have powers. I'm a new thing. Why should you suppose that a new thing would be one of the elite, an acceptable, a sensitive? No new thing has ever appeared as such. Always it comes tainted with dirty hands. If a doctorate professor of the psychical should announce a new thing in a sensitive individual, one might be tempted to consider it. But to believe that it comes out of Cathead in the form of a fortune teller on Fortune Teller's Row boggles the imagination and sets up shouts of disbelief. It's true, though. I may be the least sensitive man who ever lived. I'm crude. I live by fraud, but I can see the future." So again, these rough around the edges, strange characters in Moore's retinue. And it never gets much into the idea of necromancy and what that might mean in this novel. Mainly it's used in a divining from the entrails of a dead animal way in this novel. And hence his talk about being a fortune teller, and yet he's not above like conmanship, which is a big thing in Lafferty. Con men, mostly valorized, strangely. And it's mostly about like under people conning the elite and stuff like that throughout Lafferty's work, and you see a hint of that here. But just all this emphasis on this sort of crudeness over against some kind of perfection. And again, little physical touches, all these like little description touches are quite nice, and I would just love to see illustrators get into this novel. But Copperhead is described as goatish in appearance, and that he's like a good-humored satyr. And as to his personality, it even says that he had depths of sensitivity and intelligence and compassion, but he chose to hide these things. So summing up the group again, it says that people, they were a funny-looking party. And again, Lafferty's narrators tend to do this, like address the crowd, people, like a carnival barker or something. And again, all these like undecidable things about Evita. It says, of the bewildering Evita, had she gray eyes or blue or green? Had she smoky blonde or golden or dark hair? Was she slight or was she buxom? The fact is that all saw her differently and all heard her voice differently. It sounded now, but did it ring out or bubble up or purr or croon or lilt or laugh or intone? Was it a flute or a trumpet or a 9-stringed lyra? Was it a silver cymbal or a bronze concentus? And it never decides on these things. And I do think that's an important thing about Lafferty's work as a whole in this novel. There is some built-in, everybody's going to see this a little bit differently, and that is acceptable. That's part of how this novel works. And again, a similarity to Woolf to bring in the odd English language term or object that is in the dictionary and part of culture that most of us don't know about, or it's not that common. I don't know how common a concentus is as an instrument, but I certainly had never heard of it. And basically at this point, this whole retinue, including Thomas, all go into sort of like a trance or a transport of ecstasy, looking at the mountain and being called by it. It's got quite a poetic cadence to the description of it. And it's said that like well-adjusted people don't look about or think about mountains, much less go explore them or anything, but they decide to go. And it's said that there's no transportation in that area, so they're going to walk. So it keeps up that feeling of like a Sword and Planet type novel. And they do also have a sense that if they go this way, they might become pursued by the mechanical killers for open-mindedly looking into non-utopian aspects of the planet. And so it's a good chapter. It's very, very odd in its structure, but it does some more work of, telling us things about the planet, the utopian society, and various characters in, as I say, an odd, variegated sort of way, but it is a pleasure to read, I felt.
Stop shooting.